This is lecture 4 for the immigration training, the 6 hours in immigration training program. During lecture 4, we're going to be doing a few things. We're going to continue looking at some consecutive techniques that we started in lecture number 3. We're going to look at some basics of the regarding site translation techniques. We will be looking at court orders and how they are actually delivered and handled in immigration court. You will be doing a couple of practices dealing with court orders, and we will be also looking at some terminology of a vocabulary that special structures or sentences that or acronyms that come out in immigration court. We like to define them so that you research on what will be the appropriate transfer into your target language. In lecture number 3, we were looking at a consecutive technique that basically dealt with deciding what to do in terms of note-taking when you hear the consecutive technique, when you have to do the consecutive technique. And what we decided is that when you hear the question in English, all you need to write down was just the factual information, which was defined as address, names, descriptions, anything that it is very factual. And only if you need to have to do that. If you don't have to do that, then there's no need to write it down. If the question included a name that is very familiar to you, like Mary, then there was no need to write it down. And the reason behind that was that we don't want to write that down a lot, because when we write down a lot, we tend to disregard the message. We did talk about the answers, and in terms of the answers, we say that there are different types of answers. There are some answers where you will have different participants in that same answer. And for that, to that end, we had a technique where we divided the page into different columns. And you recall that the first column we called column 0. That column, we use it for any information that was provided to us, but we didn't know what that information, in what column that information should be placed, because by the time we hear the information, we don't know who the participant is. So for example, last week at approximately 10 p.m., that information, we don't know who the participant is, so that will be written down here in that 0 column. And then when it continues, it says, I was waiting for the bus, then you automatically take column number 1 for I, and then for any other participant, let's say it says John, you will be column number 2. And then if you went back to column number 1, you know that referred to this individual who is sort of the owner of that column. And then you may go back to John, because maybe it says, for example, John was also waiting for the bus. I was, right here it says, let's say, for example, I had just finished working. John was going to work, for example. So that's actually the format. And the way we read that, it was from top to bottom so that we can keep the sequence. The other thing that was unique about this particular technique is that between the line that separates both columns, we would write the first letter of the connector, the clause, the word that links these two ideas. Like, for example, I was waiting for the bus, and John was also there. That letter A indicates and, which you remember that in my case, I use this instead of this, but it really is that symbol instead of the letter A. There's no problem with it. You can use whichever you want. If it says, for example, I was very tired because, BC, right, B/C, because John made me work a lot that evening, for example. So the bottom line was to be able to use these connectors to connect two of the participants in that particular answer. Of course, we decided towards the end that there was no need to actually draw the columns. By doing this was sufficient for us. And if you have BC here, that clearly is between the two columns. So this is sort of the connector, the linking clause, and it was much cleaner and better. Finally, we also decided that a dot indicates the direction of where the verb goes to. For example, John came to my home and gave me a letter. And then you write the word letter here. You don't write it below I because it's John who's doing the action. So John came to my home and gave me a letter. Okay, that's some other thing that we added to that technique in lecture number 3. Now, what still remains is how do we determine which technique to use when we hear an answer at the beginning? Because you shouldn't expect this technique to work for all different answers, because some answers don't require any technique. So for questions, we already know that all we're going to write down is just the factual information in the question. That's about it. We're not writing anything else, okay? But for the answer, you have several options. For example, you can write down, you don't write anything down, so we call no notes. That's option number 1. Option number 2, you write factual information. Option number 3, you have many participants. And option number 4 is you write one word below the other, and that is sort of a very rudimentary technique, but it is useful at times. When you are not sure whether number 1 or number 2 or number 3 or whatever will work, you always fall into this one word below the other. So if you are not sure which technique to use, write one word below the other. Now, when you write one word below the other, it's important that you don't write a lot. And the question is, what do you write? There should be single words, not necessarily a whole sentence, obviously. You may have maybe 2 words on the same line, and that's as much as you can write on a given line. Because if you write from left to right, one of the problems that you're going to find is that the brain stores the information much better from top to bottom, because the brain is able to see that from one note on the top one to the next one, there is a gap, and that reminds the brain that there is something missing. If you write from left to right like this, then we are more used to reading on lines, not top to bottom, and that creates a little bit of problem. Now, in some languages, it might be helpful, but in general, that's not advisable. So when you write one word below the other, what do you write? Well, you should, if you should write a word that allows you to remember the message. Well, do you mean by that I should write down what? Something that, like what, for example? Well, let's look at this particular example, and you will find out that usually what you write are nouns, not verbs. If I say, for example, I went to the 7-Eleven store, 7-Eleven is considered to be a factual information, so that must be written down. Okay, so I went to the 7-Eleven store, so you would write down 7-Eleven there, that's for sure. And as I was inside the store, I don't have to write anything down there. A man came in, so maybe a man came in. That box here with an arrow in, it has the indication that he went in. If I had the box with the arrow going out, it means that he or she left, or I left. So I was at the 7-Eleven, and while I was in the store, a man came in with a gun. Okay, gun, you have to write it down, and ask everybody to give him all the money we had. Then those are pretty much the notes for that. You should be able to remember the rest. So 7-Eleven denotes factual information, denotes the name of the store. the man entering the store is important because it's an action, and it's important that whether it's male or female who entered, and also the fact that entered the store, that was not in the store. And the word gun is what he or she had in his hand at the time, which of course will help you recall that if he entered a store with the gun, he probably was asking for money. So that's going to help you create the message in a way. If you take the wrong notes, it's going to be perhaps more difficult. If you take, for example, I was at the 7-Eleven store, and you just write the word store, and I stay there inside, and you write inside, and then a man came in with the gun and asked for money, and then you write ask. All those words, when you read them back, will not provide you sufficient information to recall the original, simply because the notes were weak. You always, when you take notes, you always concentrate on factual information, dynamics of it, entering, leaving, staying in a place, and I'm going to show you a little trick for that, which is very helpful. And also the nouns, like what he had in his hand. In this case, it's a gun. It's not a knife. It's not an AK-47. It's not an assault rifle. And that information has to be written down. Now, there are some interesting things when you use option number 4, and you can use this, what I'm going to explain next, in any option, really, in any option where you take notes. There are some symbols that are extremely helpful, and we saw one of them. This means to enter, right? And this means to leave the store, and this means to be inside the store, okay? This is important because this is the type of symbols that we use for any part of the original where there is a dynamic type of scenario, people moving. Sometimes you can see I was at the front of the store, and then I went all the way to the back of the store, and I stayed there for 5 minutes. So this is the front for me. I went to the back, and this dot, remember, is always me, the person that you're trying to identify. And I put the 5 minutes there to denote that I stay there for 5 minutes. For example, you could say, and by the way, when you use these symbols, it is always preferable that if you have a combination of symbols, then you write them from left to right. So for example, let me give you an example. I entered the store at 3 p.m. and then I stayed in the store for about 45 minutes. Then next sentence, at approximately 3:15 p.m., John also entered the store and stayed in the store for 10 minutes. So you can see that this particular line here gives you the dynamics of what I did. In this case, you can put I if you want to. I entered the store at 3 p.m. and then that dot there inside the store means I remained in the store for 45 minutes. But now comes the second sentence. It says at approximately 3:15, so I go to the line below. Approximately 3:15, John entered the store and remained in the store for 10 minutes. And that those will be the notes. I just want to point out here that because this is a continuation of the dynamic portion of the answer, we put them from left to right. And then when that dynamic portion ends, then you move on to the next line. So if I say, for example, I was inside the 7-Eleven store at 3 p.m. and I got out of the store at approximately 3:15 p.m. That will be it. Now, if I say, for example, when a guy of about 45 years of age entered the store with a gun in his hand, that will be the second line. And that this is the type of symbol that is very helpful for anything that is dynamic. What do you mean by dynamic? Motion. Anything that has motion. Most of the answers will have motion. So it becomes extremely helpful. Now, sometimes you may say, well, I do not want to draw the box. It takes me too long. You don't have to to draw any box if you don't want to, because you can do something like this. Let me show you. You can say, for example, I enter the store, and you got to write a line there, meaning that's the boundary of the store. I enter the store at approximately 3 p.m. I remain inside the store for about 45 minutes. You can write it like that if you like. This line has to be drawn because it indicates entering, because if you just put the arrow, you don't know if it's leaving or entering. So for example, in the next line, let's say it says I left the store at approximately 3:50 p.m. That will be the notes for that. That is sort of the boundary, the wall of that store, and this means going out. This means going in. And just the dot could be for you, could be staying inside and remaining there. That way you reduce the number of notes, and our goal is really to reduce the number of notes. So when you use our option number 4, which is to write one word below the other, don't think that it has to be just words. You can also use some of these symbols, and it qualifies as a word. In fact, it qualifies as many words, because sometimes these symbols allow you to visualize something, which is much more powerful than trying to memorize something. So this is something you can certainly apply to your note-taking technique. But going back to the 4 different possibilities: number 1, no notes; number 2, factual information; number 3, a lot of participants; and number 4, one word below the other. In other words, we use number 4 when every other option fails. And of course, in number 4, you can use these symbols and things like that. Which one should you use? And that's an important question. And how do you know which one to use? Well, most consecutives give you the question in a consecutive give you an incredible hint as to what the answer is expected to be. If the question, for example, is what were you doing? What were you doing when that crime was committed? It's very possible that in the description, obviously you know that no notes will be suicidal to go to the answer, to start hearing the answer without taking any notes, because the answer is expected to be quite long. So we eliminate number 1 automatically. You may need to write some factual information. You may also need to, there may be a lot of participants, so you may need to actually use the technique we learned in lecture number 3. And of course, you use number 4 when you don't know what to do, really, when you're lost. So yeah, it's possible that you are lost and use number 4, but if you look at this particular question, what were you doing when the crime was committed? It's very possible that there will be more than one participant, and therefore option number 3 will be the most appropriate one. Option number 3, meaning the one where you have many participants, the one that we actually learned in last lecture, in lecture number 3. If, of course, the question is what is his name, then that will be option number 2, factual information. Remember, option number 1, no notes. Okay. Option number 2, factual. Option number 3, many participants. And option number 4 is one word below the other. Below the other. So these are our 4 possibilities. So if the question, of course, is where does he live, or no, what is his social security number? That's definitely factual. If you approach the answer without taking notes, it's suicidal. And in fact, not only factual, when I hear that question, I have my pen or pencil ready to take down, information down, because you really have to hear and immediately write what you hear. Because if you hear a sequence of numbers and it takes you start writing the 3rd digit in that sequence that you hear, you start writing the first digit, you write it when you hear the 3rd one. In other words, you are 2 numbers behind. you're going to have a lot of problems. The key in writing factual information is to write it as you hear it, which sometimes in the case of addresses, you may have to simplify the name of the street because there might be an apartment number. And if there is an apartment number, just shorten the name of the street. Don't write the whole street name, because by the time you write this full street name, the apartment has already been said, and it's very difficult to remember that number, particularly if right after the apartment comes the zip code and the city and so on and so forth. So in terms of factual information, the secret in making sure you get everything right is to always write something as you hear it, okay? And that, of course, will mean that you need to simplify and maybe reduce the length of, just write 2-3 words for a given, 2-3 letters for a given word. Like for example, if it is a street, you just write the first 2 letters or whatever the case is. That's a function of the speed at which you receive the message. If it is given to you at a very fast speed, then you may only need to write 2 or 3 letters of that particular street name. But if it is given to you at a slower speed, then you probably need to write, you probably will be able to write more. And it's also a function of how fast you can write. Okay, so these are all variables that we have no control. Now, if the question, for example, in your consecutive is, for example, how often do you see your friend Charles? You would expect this to be a very short answer because maybe it says every other week or whatever the case is. So the expectation here is that maybe you need to write, you can't really use number 3 because you don't expect to have many participants. Factual information, you can say, yeah, this falls into the factual information category because I'm going to be giving a number of days or so. So that could be a possibility. No notes will be a little bit risky because if he says, for example, every day, then no notes is okay. But if he says, for example, every other Wednesday at 3 p.m., then you need to write something down, unless, particularly if the segment is long. If the segment is short, you may be able to remember, but you will be heavily relying on your short-term memory. So the idea is that when you hear when you're doing a consecutive, for the question, you only write down factual information and pay attention to the question so that, keeping in mind that that question is going to give you some hint as to what the answer is going to be. And in your mind, you really want to determine which of these 4 approaches should I use for the answer. And if you are not sure about what the answer might be, just go to number 4 and write one word below the other, or with the explanation that I just gave you with the boxes or the symbols rather. Now, finally, to apply a few more symbols to number 4, I'm going to give you a few more, and then we're going to finish with the consecutive technique and move forward with sight translation technique. There are other symbols that we briefly saw in last lecture, in lecture number 3. I mentioned that if you write it like this means last week, because this means last, previous. If it's this, it will be next. It refers to future in a way. So next week will be plus week. That's next week. Okay. Now, another interesting thing that we should also keep in mind, there is a symbol that we use that's the X. And the X is to place yourself in a certain location. So, for example, let's say that the original says, I was driving on 3rd Street, and John was driving on 7th Street, and we collide at the corner. That X denotes where the action ends, where the 2 variables combined. So it's this I, and then John, and then this is the collision. Or, for example, you can say, I'll wait for you at the corner of 3rd and 7th. Okay, and that X indicates the location where you're going to be waiting for that individual or for whoever. So it's important to use the X to denote placement. Now, it's the same thing. You can say, well, I don't like to use X. Can I use the dot as you taught me earlier? And the answer is absolutely, absolutely. But the dot remains, it's unique to you. But the X is unique to the action. For example, in this case, is I was driving on 3rd, John was driving on 7th, and we collide there. So you see, if you want to use the dot in that example, it will be very difficult because the dot only really applies to this, to I. You know, the dot is always I, okay? It means to you, who basically. But the X is more of the outcome of a sequence of events, for example. So in this example, I was at the corner of 3rd and 7th. Yeah, you can put the dot. That's not a problem. But if it says, for example, the two cars collided at the corner of 3rd and 7th, then you will probably put 3rd, 7th, and the two cars colliding at that corner. And you may put two cars if you want, but you should also be able to have some short-term memory, obviously. Now, how do you develop short-term memory, which is the last thing before we finish with consecutive techniques? The best way to develop short-term memory is actually to practice consecutives without taking notes, because as soon as you start taking notes, you do not allow your short-term memory to actually work. And the only way you can improve your short-term memory is if you make it work. And the way that you make it work is by making a huge effort in remembering the message without writing anything down. So a couple of interesting practices to improve short-term memory. You can, for example, go to your online laboratory and do any of the practices that we have. But instead of just the question, you can start and you hear the question and don't take any notes. So you hear the question and you repeat it in the same language. You don't have to repeat in the opposite language. In other words, to develop short-term memory, you don't need to interpret. You can leave everything in the original language. Because as soon as you start interpreting, there is another element that comes into play, and that is the rendition portion. And here we are working on a technique that applies only to the acquisition. Remember from lecture 3? So it is always much more efficient for you to repeat in the same language what you hear. So for example, you do a consecutive from your lab, and it says, for example, what is your name? And then the pause begins in the lab. So when the pause begins, you say, what is your name? And you do that for a couple of minutes or maybe a minute or so. But then you start working into much more complicated segments. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can, for the next few segments, you hear 2 segments in a row, and then you deliver them in the same language. What do you mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, the segment is, were you at that place when the police arrived? Okay, and then the pause begins. Instead of saying, were you at that place when the police arrived? When the pause begins, you keep quiet. You wait for the next segment. And let's say the answer is, yes, I was there with my friend John. And now a pause begins in the original. When that pause begins, you say both segments. Were you at that place when the police arrived? Yes, I was there with my friend John. So what you're actually doing is you are really delivering 2 segments with a pause between both segments, which forces you to remember the original for a longer period of time. Because what we think about short-term memory, the way we think about it is, oh, it's short because it's for short segments. No, that short refers to the number to the time that you have to store that in your memory before rendering it. And it also refers to something that was just recently said. So what we want to do is to improve our short-term memory. Definitely what we want to do is we want to keep information in our brain for a little bit, or in our memory, for a longer period of time than just that information. So by hearing a segment, what is your name? And when the pause begins, we do not deliver that segment. And then we hear the answer, my name is Charles Doe. And now when the pause begins, we deliver both. What is your name? My name is Charles Doe. This is going to improve your short-term memory greatly. Now you can, if you're brave enough, you can do up to 3 segments, not more than 3, because it's hard to determine whether the segment will be very long or not. One of the things that you're going to experience when doing this practice is that you will not be accurate. This practice is not for accuracy purposes. It's for technique purposes. So if you are very accurate, you're probably not learning much in terms of the technique. The idea is that you push yourself to the limit, and when you do something like that, you clearly will not be very accurate, but you're making a huge effort to remember, and that's how short-term memory is improved. Okay, so that consecutive technique, as we discussed in lecture 3, is going to be used whenever testimony takes place. And usually the question is in English and the answer is in the foreign language. Keep that in mind. Now we're going to move on to another technique, which is called sight translation. And you might recall from lecture number 3 that I told you that in the lab, let me see what page would that be. I think that there was a practice 23 that you were supposed to complete before you started this lecture number 4. And I told you just go over it and see whether there are certain terms you don't know and do a written translation of this. Translate it in written. You should know by now that interpretation is verbal, translation is written. So you might have done that, but that's not the way. You actually were doing a translation. That's not the way that this technique is used, that interpreters use this technique. The way the interpreters use this technique is by, and we will cover this in more detail. I believe it's scheduled to be covered in lecture number 6. The sight translation is you are given a document that is written in one language, say in English, and you have to deliver that document as you're reading it into Spanish or into Russian or into Japanese or into any language, okay, into any foreign language. And when you are reading it in English, you have to make sure that it's not just the vocabulary, it's also the grammar that needs to be proper in the foreign languages. In some languages, the verbs go at the end. In some languages, the verbs match approximately the position of the verb in English. So there are all these different variations that we need to be extremely careful when we are doing the transfer into our language. Now, you will know what are the differences between the grammatical structures in your language and in English. And in some cases, that is a big issue because you need to read carefully and then restructure the whole thing completely so that it makes sense. These are all requirements that occur when you transfer that from a document from one language into the other, because the way that you will be evaluated in terms of how well or how accurately you'd render that sight translation is whether your rendition makes sense. Does it make sense? If I hear that in the foreign language, does it make sense? Do I get the same message, the same idea that the document in English is trying to convey? All right. So that's an important element of this technique. So all I'm going to tell you, because we're going to go much deeper into this in lecture number 6, all I want to tell you is that in immigration court, very rarely you do sight translations, but sight translation is part of your final examination here for this training program, so you need to pass it. You need to know it. It's not going to be too complex. It's not going to be some material that you have no idea what it is, but it could be a letter, for example, from your foreign language into English. It could be a letter talking about criminal background, or it could be a letter talking about the moral character of an individual. And from English into Spanish, it could be something very legal that uses some legal and criminal terminology and immigration terminology as well. So now what you should do after you finish this lecture 4 is you should really go back to that practice, which I believe was practice number 23. And although you have that already translated, try to now look at the original in English And as you look at the original in English, say it out loud into the opposite language. Record yourself, and then listen to your rendition and look at the translation that you have for that practice that you did probably before you took this, you attended this lecture, and see how close it is. It doesn't have to be exact, but the meaning has to be very similar. The message has to be very, very similar. Now we're going to move on to court orders in immigration court. And court orders are usually the result of it's basically the decision pronounced by the judge, the immigration judge. A court order is usually incorporated in an individual merits hearing. The individual merits hearing, as we discussed last, I believe, a couple of lectures ago, or it's actually a hearing where it's an evidentiary hearing. People present evidence. And now both parties present evidence, and there is this notice to appear here because the U.S. government believes that you are an alien who is in violation of law here in the United States. You're in the United States in violation of law. And then you are saying, wait a minute, no, I qualified to be here because I really qualified to get asylum, for example, based on the situation in my country. So both parties have to present evidence, and then the judge has to make a determination. So expect the court orders to actually be that take place after the individual merits hearing. Now, judges sometimes they do pronounce their decision right there after the hearing. Sometimes they send it to the parties in written form. So it depends who the judge is, and if it is sent in written form, obviously you will not have to interpret. But if the judge decides to pronounce these court orders or his or her decision at the end of the hearing, of the individual merits hearing, then you will need to interpret them. In what technique? Simultaneous is the technique that is used. Now, besides the court orders, you will notice that they also go over the statement of law, which is something that we see in the next lecture, lecture number 5. So if the judge decides to pronounce the court orders at the end of a given individual merit hearing, the statement of law will also be there as well. And it is quite complicated, statement of law, so we'll wait until next lecture to discuss that. It's going to be discussed in lecture number 5. And the court orders are extremely legal. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is I'm going to be playing court orders, which are typical court orders. And please do not refer to your class manual yet. We're going to do what we always do. It's very short. The court orders are very, very short. They don't last too long. The practice doesn't. And then after this practice is done, I'll come back and we'll discuss it briefly. And then what I will ask you to do is to go to the lab manual, to the class manual, and look at the key terminology for court orders and do this practice again. Keep in mind, these court orders can be at any type of speed, and usually 160 is what the speed used by judges. For this practice is at 130 words per minute. And also expect that the material that or the subject matter you're going to be working with in your online laboratory between this lecture and the next lecture, that is between lecture 4 and lecture 5, will be court orders at 3 different speeds, okay, 130, 145, and 160. So I'm going to ask you, please, to interpret these court orders, or this court order, really. There are many orders, but it's just in one case. Interpret the court orders using the simultaneous technique. So here it is.
Court orders, simultaneous. It is hereby ordered that the respondent's application for asylum be denied. It is further ordered that the respondent be removed from the United States to her country of birth on the charges contained in the notice to appear. It is further ordered that the respondent's application for withholding of removal under Section 241(b)(3) of the Act to her country of birth be denied. It is further ordered that the respondent be granted voluntary departure in lieu of removal, and without expense to the United States government on or before May 15, 2017. It is further ordered that, if required by the DHS, the respondent shall present to the DHS all necessary travel documents for voluntary departure within 60 days. It is further ordered that if the respondent fails to comply with any of the above orders, the voluntary departure order shall, without further notice or proceedings, vacate the next day, and the respondent shall be removed from the United States to the respondent's country of birth on the charges contained in the notice to appear.
So you can see after trying to interpret this that this is rather complicated because of the imagine at 160 and imagine more orders. These are just a few. And it's complicated because it has a lot of immigration terminology and legal terminology. So we're going to do this again by you looking at the terminology in a second, but I just want to point out one interesting thing about this. The word, when they say in lieu of, okay, in lieu of, it really means instead. So in lieu of removal, instead of the removal. Okay, that's pretty much it. And vacate really means to void, to cancel. To cancel, okay? So be careful with those terms. Now, I'm going to ask you please to go to your class manual now, to the table of contents, and they're under lecture number 4 in that table of contents in the contents section. I think it's page 3, I believe. In under lecture number 4, it talks about court orders, and then it talks about key terminology for court orders, and there's a page number. Go to that page number, please. And you're going to find some selected expressions from the practice that you just did. We're going to do the practice again. You're going to record yourself again, see how it works, like as you have been doing so far. If you didn't record the first one, it's okay. But this one, I would like you to record yourself. And basically, you can refer to the translations provided to you on the key terminology in your language. And we'll do the practice again, but you can refer to those to those notes, to those translations. See whether this becomes a little bit easier for you to transfer into your language, into the foreign language. So what we're going to be doing next is you're going to do court orders again in simultaneous, but this time you're allowed to look at the key terminology that it is listed in your class manual under lecture 4, key terminology for court orders. So here's the practice again. Here we go.
Court orders, simultaneous. It is hereby ordered that the respondent's application for asylum be denied. It is further ordered that the respondent be removed from the United States to her country of birth on the charges contained in the notice to appear. It is further ordered that the respondent's application for withholding of removal under Section 241(b)(3) of the Act to her country of birth be denied. It is further ordered that the respondent be granted voluntary departure in lieu of removal and without expense to the United States government on or before May 15, 2017. It is further ordered that, if required by the DHS, the respondent shall present to the DHS all necessary travel documents for voluntary departure within 60 days. It is further ordered that if the respondent fails to comply with any of the above orders, the voluntary departure order shall, without further notice or proceedings, vacate the next day, and the respondent shall be removed from the United States to the respondent's country of birth on the charges contained in the notice to appear.
Hopefully this came out better. So when we finish this lecture number 4, I would please ask you to go to the review your the audio tape of your interpretation. See, you can refer to the original that is also there under Lecture 4 under court orders. And you look at the script, and then you can determine how accurate you were. If you will have to do some additional practices in your lab, and I will discuss that before the end of this lecture, and those are longer practices that deal with court orders. Now, in this last 10 minutes that we have, I'd like to go over certain things that are used in immigration court that are considered to be quite, I guess, specialized. For example, you will hear Form 589, and you need to know what that really means. When you hear Form 589, it refers to the I-589 form, really, and it refers to an application for asylum and withholding of removal. What is this application for asylum and withholding of removal? Well, remember, in the master calendar hearing, this respondent received this notice to appear, and they want to remove him. They want to get them out of the country. So, but this respondent is saying, look, I qualify for asylum. I meet the requirements to remain in this country under those bases. So this is an application for asylum, but it's also an application to withhold the removal until they decide on the asylum, basically. Right? So when you hear Form 589, you can transfer it into your target language as Form 589. But if you have the time, because the speed is not fast for you, then it's better to translate that as application for asylum and withholding of removal. The rule when they say a form number like that, you can, if it's very fast, if you notice the judge is going really, really fast, you can't really say all these words. So you will, of course, just simply say the form, the number of that form. But if it is slow, or if it's somehow it's used in a consecutive in testimony, which is unusual, but if it is, then, or if it is in a side translation where you can read it and then deliver, so time is important but not that critical, then you can transfer this way so that the respondent understands what you are referring to, because Form 589 is something that attorneys understand but not necessarily respondent. Another one is Form 213. Okay, a Form 213, and that stands for I-213 form, and it is known as deportable, inadmissible, alien form, really. So this is to deport an alien who is inadmissible, who doesn't have any grounds to be here. Okay? So again, if you hear Form 213, you can say Form 213 or the corresponding translation, which you can research. And you should be in a position right now, after studying all the immigration terminology that is included in your class manual, to come up with a good translation for this. Another one that you will hear that it's important is something like this. Judges may say, let's say the respondent is a female. The judge may say, is she a 245I? Is she a 245I? And you see, what is that? You can imagine that if you interpret into the foreign language, is she a 245I? I mean, nobody knows what that means. Section 245I of the immigration law allows, certain persons, let me spell this, sorry. See if this erase, yeah. Certain individuals or persons who normally would be ineligible to adjust their status to permanent residents in the United States. So that section of the act, of the law, allows certain individuals who normally will be ineligible to adjust their status to permanent residence. So if you say, for example, let's say that I want to remain in this country, and because my mother is in this country legally, just to give you an example. The judge may wonder if she's a 245I, meaning if she had adjusted their status to permanent, if she has adjusted her status to permanent residence, even though she was, normally people like her will be ineligible. So it's a really difficult concept to transfer. So usually you could say, for example, instead of saying is she a 245I, you can say, did she adjust her status to permanent residence, even though normally she would, even though otherwise she would be ineligible. So did she adjust her status to permanent residence, even though otherwise she would be ineligible? So it's sort of an explanation. Clearly, you can only transfer this way if you have time. If not, you have no other option than to transfer what you hear, which is she a 245I? Okay, let's see. There is also a couple of interesting terms that apply to different countries. There is one that actually is used in all different countries, actually, in all different cases, and that is prosecutorial discretion, PD. Prosecutorial discretion. This is an interesting term because what it really means is that it gives the U.S. government, the attorney for the government, the discretion to decide on this case, to decide what will be the best way to go about it. So sometimes the judge will tell the attorney for the respondent, I leave that to the prosecutorial discretion, and that means the prosecutor has to decide what the outcome of the case will be, whether to grant an application or not to grant an application, or whatever the case is. So it's important that you understand in your target language what prosecutorial discretion. It really means leave that up to the prosecutor, okay? Leave the decision up to in this case, he will not be prosecutor, because this is a legal term. We don't have prosecutors in immigration court per se. It will be to the U.S. Attorney, or you can say the attorney for the U.S. government. Okay? This one is used a lot in immigration court, and you have to be very, very careful in terms of how to use it. What you mean by that when you transfer it. Okay, it's really, really important for you to know, to have a transfer into your target language of that particular term. Okay, then finally, the word expunge. And usually refers to expunge your record. To expunge really means you have something in your record, a conviction or whatever. When you expunge it, you basically cover it up, and not everybody can see it. The courts can see it, that conviction. The police officer can see it, but maybe if you go and look for a job or something, they won't be able to see it. So to expunge is basically a term that really doesn't mean necessarily that you delete that from your record, but it does have that connotation. It really means that it doesn't have any legal effect at this point. So a couple of possible translations. Oops, what's that? A couple of possible options for this is, yes, to delete. You can say that, or you can say to be ineffective. So look for a transfer into your target language that conveys the meaning that expunge means it is in your background, but not everybody can see it. And it is sort of covered up for certain individuals. So yes, you can say delete, or you can say that it doesn't have any effect for certain organizations or entities that look at your record, or that those organizations or entities will not be able to see it. It's more complex to go and use the second route, so that meaning the organizations will not see it. It's preferable to say to delete, so that way it's much more clearly understood. All right. Now, so what do we have? What do you have to do for next week? Well, in lecture number 4, you have a section on immigration terminology, starting with machine readable passport, and the translation is provided to you. This is in your class manual under lecture 4, immigration terminology. And you start with that letter, and I think it ends with letter Q, with qualifying date. You need to create the flashcards, and you need to know the translations or the transfers of these terms, and also understand what they mean. What is the definition in English? Then you have the court orders that you need to really know very well, and the key terminology for court orders. So you will create your flashcards for the key terminology, and then you will practice these court orders. Where would you practice court orders? Well, you have to go to your lab, and when you go to your online laboratory, where it says, if you go to now we're talking about the online laboratory manual. When you go to the table of contents, which is on page 3, I believe at the bottom, it says practices to be completed after finishing lecture 4 and before beginning lecture 5. And there you have practice 26, 27, and 28. It's a very comprehensive number of court orders, and they are all given to you at the 3 speeds that we usually use, 130, 145, 160. The way you deal with this is the same way you have been doing this, and that is you do the 130, record yourself, make sure you make sense when you listen to your recording. You can look at this transcript and see whether you're missing certain things. If you are, make sure you memorize that and you review that portion that you're having difficulties with. And then only after you're satisfied with this 130 words per minute speed, you move on to 145. You repeat the same steps, and then finally 160, and you repeat the same steps. All right, so this ends lecture number 4. Thank you.